Chapter 20. I stood up, and so did Sybil and Tabitha. That wasn't nearly as bad, Tabitha mumbled. But coming home is always a good feeling. Ah, Sybil said as she headed toward the bed. The little one is still sleeping. I looked over on the bed, and sure enough, Casanova was still fast asleep. But from outside the window I heard an owl hoot, and I realized that it was already nighttime in Lupercalia. We should try to get some sleep as well, I said. It's a big day tomorrow, and we need to be in top form if we're going to slay Wenderoth and reclaim the Obsidian Temple. You're right, Sybil replied as she patted Casanova on his head. She stood up and pulled her green dress over her head and cast it on the floor. Then she went over to the bed and plopped her tired body on the side closest to the window without even bothering to pull a quilt over her. Oh my, Tabitha murmured. I guess we really are bonding on this quest. What? Sybil asked as she yawned. Her eyes were half closed and out of focus, and she already seemed half asleep. Do they not allow nudity in the palace? We'll say they have a stiff upper lip, Tabitha replied and shrugged her shoulders. But I was always a fan of skinny dipping. But there was no reply. I looked over at Sybil, who was splayed on her stomach, on the bed with Casanova at her head. She was already snoring lightly, and the sight of them passed out together like that made my heart warm. I turned back to Tabitha. Wow, she was tired. I stretched my arms over my head and my back even cracked slightly. We probably all need a rest, Tabitha said, and then the tension in the room turned up as we stared at each other. Yeah, rest? I finally cleared my throat and glanced back at my sleeping lover. You should probably go back to your room. Of course, Tabitha whispered. But, just so you know, I don't know what it's like in New Jersey, but you know, a lot of the knights in Lupercalia have more than one female companion. She blinked at me with her big brown eyes, and the right side of her mouth curled into a smile. I obviously thought she was sexy as hell, so hearing that this was the norm in Lupercalia came as a relief. Oh, I responded in a low voice. I suppose that is a good thing to know. Yes, she responded. Something to think about, perhaps. I really like spending time with you and Sybil. I think we've had a lot of fun together. She turned and walked over to the door, and lifted her small, elegant hand and waved at me. Good night, Tabitha, I smiled. Good night, Hank, she replied and closed the door behind her. I pulled off my shirt and stepped out of my pants and made my way over to the bed. I lay next to Sybil and thought about Tabitha's proposition. I'd never had more than one girlfriend at a time before, but it was obviously every dude's dream. I turned to the candle on the night table and blew it out. The room went completely black except for the moonlight, and I fell into a deep dreamless sleep a few moments later, and I didn't wake up until something wet started to lick my face. Who? I mumbled and peeled my eyes open. Casanova looked back at me with a happy doggy grin on his face, which I returned with one of my own. I then looked around the room and saw that Tabitha was back, and the women were sorting through our supplies. How long were you going to wait before waking me up? I laughed. Dawn just broke, Tabitha assured me, and squires are usually up before their night to make sure everything is ready for the day. And to prepare breakfast, Sybil said and rolled her eyes. Or to demand that the innkeeper prepare breakfast. Breakfast, I said and rubbed my eyes. From Sybil if it meant food. Bowl with what looked like oatmeal and stewed apples that smelled absolutely divine, like all of autumn rolled into one, even though it was still summer. Bowl. Just the smell alone made me feel invigorated. This smells incredible, I said and dug in. While I ate, the girls finished the preparations for the day. Had been packed, Sybil slipped Casanova into her basket. Should I give him some of the oatmeal? I asked when I realized I only had 2 spoonfuls left. He had the leftover pie for breakfast, Sybil replied. I'm pretty sure he's going to need some meat soon. I laughed as I washed down my porridge with the steaming moonbeam brew. I felt like I was drinking pure light. I gulped down the last of my meal, took care of my morning business, and then began the process of preparing for battle. The clothes were easy enough, but Tabitha helped with some of the armor, which definitely shortened the time it took to get ready. When the last piece of armor was in place, I picked up my "Shall we?" I asked. I followed her out, and as we descended the creaky staircase, Tabitha tapped me on the shoulder. I've figured out our route for today, she said, from where we are now, so I'll be sure to steer you in the right direction. Thanks, I said. When we reached the bottom of the stairs, we found that the inn was empty. After all of her wonderful hospitality, I already told her as much this morning, and she invited us all to come back here for a night after we defeat Wenderoth. Sunlight. The smell of sweet williams filled my nose and I took a deep breath, while Tabitha studied her map. So are we walking the whole way? Sybil asked innocently. Oh right. I started shaking my head back and forth and instinctually fell forward onto my hands like I was doing a push-up, but when I opened my eyes I could see everything in much more detail. I was the great wolf again. I sat down on my hind legs to make sure that the girls could crawl on top of me. Tabitha sat closest to my neck again, and Sybil took a seat behind her. Remember northwest, Tabitha said into my ear. I'll guide you if we start to head off course. Once I was speeding again through the soft woods. I smelled dew and moss in the air, and became more aware of my animal senses. I kept running until the inn was miles in the distance. Into my back. I felt like we were all perfectly synchronized on that run. Suddenly I smelled something fresh to my right. I had never seen a melted glacier, but when the fresh and cold smell hit my nose I imagined a glacier. We had found a stream of very cold water, which explained why I'd imagined a glacier. Tap on the shoulder. We can have some water and refresh ourselves before we reach the temple. Don't worry, little one, Sybil cooed. We're going to have some water soon. From where I was standing, I could see that the water was blue and clear. Fact, it was almost the sheen of blue Gatorade. I couldn't remember seeing water that blue in my entire life except in pictures of ice in the Arctic. I sat down on the ground and waited for the girls to dismount. Thanks, Hank, Sybil shouted, and once I felt the weight of the girls and Casanova disappear, I decided to switch back. I raised up on my hind legs and transformed, but this time I didn't imagine myself as a human. I thought it would be more wise to become my hybrid form, since we were close to the temple. When I opened my eyes I still found my height startling in this form. Always took me a moment to adjust to the sudden height difference, and I felt myself grin as I scanned the area for any problems. Oh my, Tabitha purred. Aren't you a big puppy? I smirked, which felt very different with my hybrid wolf jowls, and then I made my way over to the stream. I took a quick look at my reflection, which revealed a slender wolf face and armor that glistened in the dappled sunlight, and then dunked my head in the water and sucked in 3 massive gulps with my face submerged. When I pulled my head out of the water, I felt a cool hit of fresh air. Breathed in the scent of cypress and cedar while I let my eyes drift over the nearby forest. I saw movement near some branches and realized that Sybil had wandered away from the stream, no doubt to look for some plant or other. I gave a low growl, and the witch looked back and waved her hand. Don't mind me, Sybil called back. I thought I just saw some lavender, which would be excellent for relaxation after a battle. I'm just going to go fetch some. Don't go too far, I warned. Stay where I can see you. Oh, it's only lavender, Tabitha said, and wiped the blue water from her chin. I doubt there's any real threat. But just as she said that, a scream sounded from the bushes. It was Sybil, and she was still carrying Casanova to boot. I looked over at Tabitha, who immediately drew a silver axe out of her pouch. It wasn't the most refined weapon, but it was more refined than the one I'd been given on my first quest. I considered my own options for a second and went with the silver dagger. Dropped the sack to the ground once it was in my hand, and then Tabitha and I leapt across the brook together. Sybil, Tabitha shouted as he landed. We pushed through a wall of bracken before finding Sybil, who was being chased by a man in the opposite direction. By now all of my senses were tingling, and I could sense something fetid and rotten in the air. As Tabitha and I gave chase, I could see that the man was dressed in a silk shirt and cotton pants. The silk suggested money, but the shirt looked old and faded, so it could have been stolen. But it was the smell that I was focused on. It was a sort of rotten sweet, like fruit that had been left out in the sun, and just beneath that was the heavier scent of iron. It took me a moment, but I soon realized that we weren't chasing a man. We were chasing a vampire. He looked over to see who was following him, and I got a look at his ugly face. He had pale, mottled flesh and an open gash from his mouth to his cheek. But there was no blood or veins, just thick gummy flesh that flapped open. He spread his deformed face into a grin, and I could see a dirty yellow fang popping out of the side of his jaw where his cheek should have been. If I were in my normal human form, I probably would have barfed at just how ugly he was. The glowing red eyes were the only thing that looked alive. Everything else was dark and bruised, from the circles under his eyes to the yellow patches on his exposed skin. Anyone who thought vampires were romantic hadn't seen one of these bastards. His rotten scent grew stronger as I closed in on the creature, and though the thing didn't seem to have a heartbeat, I could sense that he was starting to flag. Still, he was a predator with its prey in sight just like me, and he kept running after Sybil even though he had to know that there was no way he could win this battle. I heard Tabitha's steps start to slow though, and when I looked over my shoulder, I saw her lean against a tree to catch her breath. "Keep going," she shouted and waved her axe. "I can protect myself." I hated to leave Tabitha behind, but I couldn't smell any other vampires nearby, and at least the squire had an axe and knew how to fight. I nodded and then focused on the race again. Sybil was starting to tire as well, but she'd managed to put some real distance between her and the vampire. The thing probably hadn't eaten in some time because it had slowed to little more than a jog. I closed to within a few yards and then leapt into the air. I opened my jaws at the peak and stretched my claws on my left hand. Everything around me slowed down, and I somehow knew what precise adjustments to make to my flight to ensure that I landed in the middle of the vampire's back. There was a brief moment when the vampire looked back at me again, and I saw the red eyes widen. But then our bodies slammed together and smashed into the soft ground. I held his face in the soil with my free end, and then instinct took over. I bared my teeth and tried to bite the vampire in the neck. But instead of going in smoothly like it had with the brigands, it felt tough. It reminded me of thick leather, or bubblegum that had been chewed for way too long. His skin was gummy in my jowls, and I couldn't penetrate it to rip him to shreds. I threw back my head and howled in frustration as the vampire squirmed beneath me. I saw Sybil finally stop running and turn around to look, though wisely she didn't come any closer. "Hank!" Tabitha panted as she ran up behind me. The vampire hissed and reached out with one of his mottled, yellow hands toward the voice. I dug my claws into the back of the hand, and the vampire made a howl of its own. "This one's weak," Tabitha panted. "But we have to kill him or else it'll keep following us." The vampire must have understood Tabitha's warning, because it suddenly started to squirm even harder beneath me. Somehow it managed to turn beneath me so that I had another view of its ugly face. The jowls had been torn in two, and the teeth were yellowed and broken. Splotches marred the skin, and slices showed where others had managed to use a knife on the creature. He looked at me and hissed, and then his hands flew up toward my face. His fingernails were full of blood and dirt, and something that looked like pus covered one palm. Before I could strike, Tabitha kicked out. Her boot made contact with a forearm, and there was a cracking sound before both arms flopped to the ground. Again. "They just keep attacking until they're dead," she warned. "Destroy the brain." I nodded, lifted the silver dagger over my head, and plunged it into the vampire's ugly forehead as hard as I could. Now that felt smooth. Warm butter, and I understood now why it was deemed such a powerful weapon. Using silver against this predator felt even easier than when I'd attacked the brigands with my sharp teeth. I felt like it could cut through anything. Before he finally went still. His mouth was still hanging open, and his eyes stared blankly at the sky, but there was no movement and no signs that he was still, well, not alive exactly, but definitely not going to follow us. I stood up and scanned the forest for any other vampires as well as the witch. I spotted my companion in the distance, where she had clearly decided to remain until she was sure the vampire was dead. "Sybil!" I yelled. "It's done. You can come back." Sybil raised her hand and started to walk back toward us. As she picked her way toward us, I used my wolf senses to check for any more vampires in the area, but the one I just killed seemed to be the only one. "Well," I said. "Good to have a dress rehearsal." Tabitha's face was twisted in an expression of disgust. Her chest rose and fell in rapid succession after running for so long, and her hands were placed firmly on her hips. Her entire face glistened from sweat in the dappled sun, but she still managed to look badass. "I've never seen a vampire in real life before," she admitted and shook her head. "But that was exactly what my father said they were like, down to the last detail. Fast but stupid. That one barely had any idea of how to fight." "Yeah," I agreed, "though it was very determined, and that can make it very dangerous. So, do you want to do the honors or shall I?" She looked at me with a confused expression, so I gestured at the silver dagger that was sticking so satisfyingly out of his head. Oh, she said and scowled slightly. Well, guess I've got to learn someday if I'm going to be a squire. Recovering weapons is one of my tasks, after all. Atta girl, I laughed. She bent down, grasped the dagger with both hands and pulled as hard as she could, but it didn't budge. Then she looked up at me and laughed. You really pinned him down, didn't you? She asked. I wanted to be sure, I replied. She shook her head and then tightened her grip. She grunted as she tugged at the dagger, and I could see the muscles in her arms bulge as she tried to free the knife. And then there was a wet popping sound as the knife came free, and Tabitha stumbled backwards and landed on her but in a pile of leaves. Okay, maybe I should do my own weapon retrieval from now on, I suggested as I helped her to her feet. I'm fine, she said as she brushed a few bits of dried leaf from her butt. And I do need the practice. I grinned at her and then looked at the vampire. There was no blood around the wound, just a gaping hole in the middle of his forehead and some gray pulp that I assumed was his brain matter. It was disturbing but not in the gory death way. There was something eerie about the whole thing and I felt myself shudder as I looked at the corpse. Are all the vampires like this one? I asked. I mean, it seems weird that they're so hard to get rid of when that one was so weak. I heard Sybil's voice say. She stomped through the pile of leaves that Tabitha had fallen into and glared at the corpse. Her face was flushed completely red, and the bottom of her green dress was covered in mud. Casanova was curled up in the basket, surrounded by lavender, though I saw the pup study everything around him. You did, he leaned against me. Good thing you're always around to save me. That wasn't just any creepy forest man, Tabitha said. That was a full-blown vampire. A strange creature as he popped out of the bushes. Must be malnourished, Tabitha asserted and picked up her sack. That's what. They lose all their strength and their senses. Not that they have much sense anyway. Monsters to set foot in our fine kingdom. I shot a look at Sybil and she squinted at me. We were both on the same page. Sybil asked in a sweet voice. When they're well fed, they're powerful and can create more vampire cronies to keep the species going. But they're pests, like rats or wasps or something. They're nowhere near as intelligent as us Lupercalian folk. But then why have we all been under the siege of vampires for so long? Sybil probed. If the nobility is so much smarter, then why are these pests, as you put it, still here? I could tell that the question was getting under Tabitha's skin because she squirmed slightly in her armor and shook her head. Look, Sybil, it's a reasonable question, Tabitha admitted. But you're just a folk witch, and I've been educated in the ways of Lupercalian battle since birth, so I know that there's only one way to kill a vampire for sure, and that's what makes it so difficult to eradicate them. I have family members that have been killed by vampires, Sybil protested. Ladies, I said. I looked at both of them and I could sense that their heart rates had risen. Even Casanova was watching the argument with a look of concern. She thinks she knows everything, Sybil muttered. This is new territory for all of us, I said quickly before Tabitha could respond. Tabitha, you said that you've never seen a vampire in person before today, and neither have we. I think the most important thing is that we take all of these things as they come. Maybe some vampires are stupid, maybe some are not, but the important part is that we beat them. Okay, guys. Sybil exhaled, and Tabitha looked at the ground and nodded. Sorry for being a know-it-all, the noblewoman said. They just crammed all this information into my head since I was a child, and the only thing I really know to do with it is spout it off like I'm taking another test. And sorry for sounding suspicious of the nobility, Sybil said. I know that. The knights do the best they can and that things would be much worse if they weren't here. Casanova joined in with a low whining sound that distracted the girls from their argument. Sybil gave him a reassuring pat on the head while Tabitha made a soft cooing noise at him. Well, Tabitha declared a moment later and started to look around. It's got to be here somewhere. That vampire couldn't have traveled very far. What are you talking about? Sybil asked. Vampires are like magpies, Tabitha replied. They collect shiny things. Oh, bet we could find some good loot if we can find his hiding spot. I smiled and started to look around our immediate area as well. After all, I did have a certain advantage at 9 feet tall. But it was my nose that led us to success. When I sniffed the air, I could detect the faint trail the vampire had left as it moved through the trees, and, as I followed it, I saw that it led to an old rabbit hole. This smells like the vampire, I said as I knelt beside the hole. Let me get my sack. I found my sack where I had dropped it and then stomped back to the rabbit hole. Neither of the girls had reached inside yet, though they were both staring at the old den curiously. We thought we'd let you have the honors, Tabitha said as I knelt down. In case there's any snakes or something in there, Sybil added with a wink. Gee, thanks, I replied, but I grinned as I said it. I reached inside of the hole and pulled out a small box. If I had been back in Jersey in one of the antique shops in my hometown, I definitely would have thought it was some kind of old cigar box, but I didn't know if they had tobacco in Lupercalia. That's odd, Tabitha said. Why would a vampire have a pipe leaf box? Well, I guess that answered my question. What are pipe leaves? I asked as I pried open the thin wooden top to the box. It's what you put in a pipe, of course, Sybil laughed. We grow them on our farm and dry them in the summer, and the boys like to smoke them after a successful sale or a good harvest. Maybe that's why his teeth were so yellow, Tabitha purred. In the box I found 2 bars of moon silver and what looked to me like an amulet. It had a thin leather chain, but the amulet itself was round and had a man and a woman in the middle who were holding hands. Out of their conjoined hands grew a flower that looked like the rosette windows in the palace. Whoa, I said and stood up. Surrounding the man and woman, around the rim of the circular amulet, was an inscription that I couldn't make out. It looked like a mix of Sanskrit and Greek lettering, and I didn't even know where to begin with it. Sybil, I said. She perked up. What fee you got there? It's an amulet, I said. But there's an inscription which I can't make out at all. She held out her pale, lithe hand and took the amulet from me. It looked so small in my hands, but when she held it, I realized that it almost took up her whole palm. Oh my, she sighed and took a closer look. What is it? Tabitha asked as she leaned in for a closer look. I don't recognize that script. It's an apotropaic inscription, Sybil announced matter-of-factly. A trophy what? I asked and shook my head. Bless you, Tabitha said drolly. It means it's a magic inscription, Sybil explained. And if I understand this spell correctly, this amulet aids quick healing in battle. How the hell did you decipher that? Tabitha asked as she plucked the amulet from Sybil's hand. I'm a witch, Sybil said and shrugged. We learn runes and symbols and plants. You're a noblewoman, so you learn battles and manners and how to convince guards not to tell on you. Tabitha let out a big, hearty laugh and Sybil joined in. Here, Tabitha said and held out the amulet. Put it on for good luck. Thanks. I laughed and pulled the amulet over my head. It rested on top of my armor elegantly. I looked up at the sky and saw that it was definitely mid-morning and rapidly approaching noon. I didn't want to wait much longer to get to the town. After all, we had to get back as well, and if our first vampire kill was anything to go off of, there might be more of the creatures lurking in the woods and not just in the temple grounds. I think we should get going, I said. Tabitha, can you point us in the right direction? We go straight north from here, she said and pointed. Well, I still managed to get some lavender, Sybil noted. Well, that's a relief, Tabitha laughed. Makes the whole vampire thing worth it then. I shook my head back and forth and summoned the energy of the great wolf to course through me. I let myself fall to my arms, and when I looked down I saw the great big paws that had emerged where my hands used to be. I sat down and the girls piled on top of me. Tabitha wrapped her arms around my neck while Sybil wrapped her arms around Tabitha's waist. I felt like some kind of furry motorcycle. Onward! Tabitha laughed, and I sped into the distance. As I ran deeper into the woods, I began to notice more of the differences that the girls had told me about. The birdsong, for example, was lower in tone and less melodic, so that they sounded more like humans than birds. It reminded me of being in a crowd in a large building, where everyone is talking but it's hard to pick out just one particular conversation. The colors of these woods were also deeper, like a camera filter had been put over the whole thing. The greens of the plants looked like they were layered in shades of green, and the splashes of water we passed were an almost psychedelic shade of blue. At a certain point, the smell of moss and dew began to dwindle, and I began to pick up on something more arid and stony. My paws were beginning to feel the weight of having carried 2 girls for miles, and I started to pant as I ran. The stony, arid smell got stronger, and I realized that we were approaching the end of the forest. Slowly, the moss petered out into a drier kind of dirt, one that was less soft and bouncy, but even the hard dirt started to disappear and patches of shiny, black sand started to appear. "We're close," Tabitha whispered in my ear. I could see where the tree line ended just ahead, and as I neared it I slowed to a walk. The air had gone still, and the sun beat down like we were on the Jersey Shore in August. I stepped cautiously from the trees and took in the scene. The black sand covered everything, and the ground was devoid of plant life as far as I could see. But just ahead was another small town, though this one had been built of gray stone rather than wood. "This is it," Tabitha said. "This is the village of the Obsidian Temple." Chapter 21. The village looked and felt empty. There were no livestock or horses nearby, and I couldn't hear any voices from the buildings. Everything was gray and drab, and if I hadn't been there on a quest I probably would have left, without even bothering to look around. But I was there to kill Wenderoth, so I plodded across the black sand to a stone courtyard. Despite the sun overhead, the stones beneath my feet were cold, and I felt the hairs on the back of my neck start to prickle. "It's such a shame," Tabitha sighed. "This place used to be one of the busiest market towns in Lupercalia." I stopped in the middle of the courtyard and looked around. The courtyard was surrounded by two-story buildings that looked like homes, and further along the road were shop fronts. It looked like something out of a horror movie, where the hero stumbles across what was clearly a prosperous town but can't find any people. And hovering over the town was a shining black dome that somehow seemed to reflect as well as absorb the gray light that surrounded the area. I sat down in the middle of the courtyard to signal that the women should get off, because if anything jumped out at us it was best that I was in my hybrid form to deal with it. Both of my ladies slid off my back, and when I felt their weight was gone I reared up onto my hind legs. I imagined myself at a towering 9 feet tall, and when I opened my eyes I was in my hybrid form, armor and all. I took a quick sniff of my surroundings, which was now my natural first reaction when venturing into an unfamiliar area, but all I could detect was cold and damp, full of fog. In fact, it seemed like the atmosphere was thickening around us into a cloud. "Do you see that?" I asked the two girls and nodded toward the approaching cloud cover. "Yep," Sybil said. "We're at a higher altitude than the forest. In fact, this area is known for its rapidly forming fog, which can turn into clouds." I looked down at Tabitha and noticed that her features were less distinct as my vision was clouded with gray. I took a step closer toward the girls so that we wouldn't get separated from each other, though I was sure I could still track them by scent even in the thickest fog. "I didn't know that," Tabitha said. "Is that why this place was chosen by vampires? Not only is it an affront to the Lupercalian nobility because it's a holy site, but it's almost—" I looked down and realized that I could barely see my feet. Seriously thick fog, and I wasn't convinced that it was entirely natural, but we had to go forward no matter what. "Well," I sighed. "Moonring. But this time we just needed to make sure we could stick together." Sybil laced her arm through my left arm, while Tabitha took my right. "Hey, Sybil," I said. "What?" she asked nervously. "Remember when I was telling you about the Wizard of Oz, back in the castle?" I asked. "Yes," she said and squinted up at me. "They'd stay together," I said. "They linked arms." "Did you mention something about a movie?" "Yep," I replied. "It's called The Wizard of Oz. It's an adventure that I was telling Sybil all about when we were in the palace. The next time we go back to New Jersey we can watch it." "Want to watch all the movies in the world?" "That's not very noble sounding of you," Sybil giggled. "But it sounds like the perfect way to end the day," I replied. "Just sitting on the couch with your best friends, your dog, and a box of popcorn. What could be better?" "Not much," Tabitha replied. "Except cinnamon buns," Sybil added. "True," I agreed. "We'll have to pick up some cinnamon buns as well," Tabitha asked. "Right," I assured her. We reached the merchant buildings, and while the homes had still looked habitable, this part of the town looked dilapidated. Doors were missing, windows had been smashed, and I could see holes in the roofs that let sunlight stream inside the buildings. We passed an inn with rosette windows, but an ugly stench wafted out of the building to discourage any further investigation, and just up the street was a once stately home, but a sickly, I could feel Tabitha's weight pull at my right arm, and when I looked down I saw that she had started to slump over. Uncertain before, and I nudged her gently with my elbow. "Everything okay, Tabitha?" I asked when she looked up. "This is my kingdom, our kingdom to protect. You spend years learning about all the victories of Lupercalia, but looking at this is making me wonder if we can ever win our battle against the vampires. I saw what you did back there to that vampire, and we've both seen what Hank can do. He was chosen by the moon goddess, for goodness sake, so you can't start doubting yourself now." Tabitha peeped up from under her long eyelashes, and a subtle smile spread across her lips. "Thanks, Sybil," she said. "That means a lot." "She's right, Tabitha," I agreed. "We're going to get this place back in shape. And what's a better place to start than where Lupercalians were given the gift to shift in the first place?" "You're right," Tabitha said. She perked up, and I could tell by her quickening walk that our pep talk had erased whatever doubts had started to creep into her mind. "Look at how it glows," Sybil said, and pointed to the great dome. "It just feels magical." The slick black surface did seem to give off a light of its own, despite the encroaching fog. The temple wasn't all that large, which surprised me, and I knew a couple of churches in my hometown that were definitely bigger. The surface of the building was so smooth that it looked like the temple had been carved from one giant piece of obsidian rather than carved blocks. There were windows as well, and it looked like there was even a pane of glass at the top of the dome. Tiny flecks of lights danced in the air around the temple, like it was surrounded by a halo. I had a feeling it had something to do with the way the obsidian blocks had been cut and put together, but my high school physics classes were a bit of a blur, and besides, sometimes it was just fun to enjoy the magic of a place. "Whoa," I whispered. "This place is sacred," Sybil finished for me. "You can feel the goddess presence here, despite the vampires." Casanova popped his head out of the basket to get a better look at the temple. He sat there with his tongue hanging out of his mouth, which is kind of how I felt as I stared at the great black walls. We'd made our way out of the thickest of the fog by then, and as we neared the temple, I unlinked hands with both the girls so I could reach for my weapons. "All right," I said. "No going back now." "Ha!" Tabitha barked. "No chance of that now. I'm ready to take on whatever's in there." Sybil didn't say anything, but she nodded in agreement, so I knew that it was time for us to do what we came to do. It was time to defeat Winderoth. We approached the entrance slowly, and though at first I thought the massive black door was also obsidian, I quickly realized that it was actually wood that had been painted and polished to resemble the black stone. The door sat beneath a great archway that sparkled with tiny bits of light that looked like glitter in a night sky. A silver crescent moon and a hybrid-sized silver doorknob were the indications of whose temple we were about to enter. I looked back at the girls one more time, and Tabitha nodded, so I stepped ahead and laid my hand on the cool silver doorknob. Part of me was expecting that something would happen as soon as I touched it, but nothing did. I turned the knob slowly and opened the door barely an inch. I was actually surprised that there wasn't some sort of lock, but I quickly forgot about that when I was hit with the stench. "Oh, goddess!" Tabitha spluttered while Sybil covered her nose with her hand, and Casanova darted into the basket full of lavender. The fact that I wasn't the only one who could smell it this time really spoke to how powerful the stench was. It was like rotting fish and dead flowers, an aroma combination that I hoped I'd never have to smell again. "Here," Sybil coughed as she handed Tabitha a bunch of lavender. The witch then plucked a second bunch from the basket and handed it to me. I held it up to my nose. It didn't make the smell completely disappear, but it certainly made it a hell of a lot more tolerable. "Thanks," Tabitha said. "You know, that was a good instinct to pick that. Really did come in useful." I quickly reached inside my sack and pulled out my helmet. I hadn't worn it so far other than the joust, but this was the battle I'd been preparing for this entire journey. I pulled the helmet over my head and arranged it so that my ears stuck out. I felt different in the helmet, like I was some kind of machine. I pulled the dagger from my sack as well, and I saw Tabitha pull her own weapon out as well. "Ready?" I asked quietly. The girls nodded, so I took a deep breath and then flung open the door. The air was noticeably colder inside, and not just because of the stone. It was like winter had descended on the temple. There wasn't much sunlight to heat up the obsidian walls either, but the glass at the top of the dome let in just enough to create beams of light that bounced off the dark glass like a really weird laser light show. The remnants of an old tapestry hung in tatters from one of the other windows, and a smashed altar had been pushed to one side. There were other chunks of debris scattered on the floor, and a moment later I realized that most of it was human bones in various stages of decay. Apparently Winderoth simply left his victims where they fell once he'd had his fill. Fucker, I muttered. This place feels like death, Tabitha said in her low, husky voice, and her words rattled and jumped off of the walls as they traveled around the circumference of the temple. A blood-curdling laugh erupted from somewhere in the temple, and I had a flashback to the voice of the possessed girl from The Exorcist. Sybil jumped, and Casanova burrowed deeper into the basket. Tabitha, however, took a battle stance with her legs slightly bent and her axe held behind her head. Where are you? Show yourself. My voice echoed around the temple, and then I heard footsteps. It was hard to see clearly in the inky blackness of the temple, so it took me a moment to spot the opening in the opposite wall. The footsteps were coming from the opening, and they sounded like they were coming up a set of stairs. Have patience, the voice replied. It was sonorous and gravelly, and it made my skin crawl. The echo of the footsteps died away, and Winderoth appeared in the empty space. Unlike the other vampire, Winderoth still looked nearly normal. His cream shirt was clean and carefully fastened with a leather cord near the throat. His pants were tight brown suede rather than the usual leggings I'd seen around Lupercalia, and a delicate silver chain glittered around his neck. Hell, the vampire looked like a rock star, from the glossy gray ringlets to the red eyes, though Winderoth's red eyes weren't from contact lenses. His skin was white and plump, and glistened like the obsidian rocks around him, and his beard and mustache gave him a devilish look. The vampire also wore rings on both hands, and I could tell that most were moon-silver rings, though one was made out of obsidian. They glittered in the beams of reflected light as he held out his hands and smiled at us. Welcome to my hovel, dog, he said in his low, creepy voice. Have you just come to insult the place, or are you here as a blood delivery? I growled, but Winderoth smirked in reply. We have been sent by the king, Tabitha replied. We are here to reclaim what has been stolen. Quiet, squire, the vampire shouted, and I could hear the bones on the floor rattle as his voice echoed through the temple. Tabitha went quiet as she grasped her weapon even tighter and seethed, but I knew that she wouldn't let her anger lead her. She'd been training for this type of thing for years, and bad things happen when a fighter gave into emotion instead of listening to their training. She took a breath to steady herself and then scowled at the vampire. Very good, he growled. I'm glad to see you can follow basic instructions. As for you, good night, I assume you're the one who's supposed to kill me. How special, the vampire rolled his eyes. And so I suppose you know my name. You're Winderoth, I answered. And I'm here to end your tyranny. Winderoth cackled again, and the sound sent a chill down my spine. It's so good to feel notorious, he smiled. You spend weeks and weeks living practically under a rock, and the first person to come and find you knows exactly who you are and what you're doing there. That truly makes me a special kind of vampire, doesn't it? I was fixated on Winderoth, but I could almost feel Sybil wince. There was something up with this guy, and not just that he was an evil creature who's I said, he growled. Doesn't that make me special? The word special boomed throughout the temple, rattling the bones on the floor even more than last time. Vampires really were. Thank you, he said in a slightly pitiful voice. It's always important to recognize each other for our talents. Now, what were you saying about killing me? I was silent for a moment because whatever I said, he would probably twist it in some weird way. Shy, he sighed. No matter. I know that you're here to kill me. They have no sympathy in the palace for our way of life. Your way of life is to terrorize our people, Tabitha snapped. And the vampire's eyes glowed more brightly, but he didn't move any closer. Answer me this, princess, how else am I supposed to eat? You look like a fresh specimen, he said as he turned back to me. Your armor is nowhere near as beautiful as some of the other knights that they have sent to try and kill me, so you're clearly new to the court. Now that is interesting. Why is that king of yours sacrificing one of his young pups to the vampire Winderoth, rather than sending another seasoned fighter? I guess you could say that I'm a special kind of knight, I replied. Ah. His face lit up. A man after my own heart. I could feel the lavender that Sybil had given me crumpling in my hands. So special, in fact, Windroth continued, that he can't step into the lair of the vampire without his smelling salts? Why, it seems like you're just another one of the privileged little boys that the palace sends out on a heroic but useless mission that ends with your slaughter. How dare you? Tabitha seethed. Windroth turned his head and looked directly into Tabitha's eyes. She managed to keep her stance despite his terrifying gaze, but I could tell that something about this whole encounter was getting to her. Vampires weren't supposed to be witty and discerning. They were supposed to be like livestock. Windroth, however, was definitely not the type of idiot that the palace had told us about. How dare I? The vampire laughed. I think I know a little bit more about battling knights than you do, girl. If I could place a bet, I'd say that you've never seen a vampire in the flesh in your life. Am I right? We took out one of your little friends in the woods only this morning. The noblewoman replied with a laugh of her own. Ah, he sighed. Yes, them. My children. I always think I'm going to want a friend to stick around perhaps, so I'll turn them into a vampire, but then I get sick of them, you know? And how many Lupercalians are really going to travel to a village that's known to be teeming with vampires? First I strike up a deal with my offspring. They bring me all the humans they find, and they can keep a share of the blood for themselves. But then I get sick of sharing with these sniveling beasts, and so I'm forced to send them away or kill them outright. And what happens next? The king sends out children like you to come and fight them and then receive a trophy for shooting a fish in a barrel. Bastard! Tabitha cried and ran at the vampire. The noblewoman had clearly decided to toss her training aside, and before I could grab her arm, she launched herself into the air and flew toward the vampire. The axe swung over her head as she began to drop toward the vampire. But the not-so-stupid creature was already grinning and ready for her attack. The vampire stepped out of her path at the last possible second, and as she tried to turn the axe toward him, he grabbed her arm and slammed her into the ground. Tabitha yelped as she smashed into the hard stone, but before she could find her feet, the vampire pinned her against the floor. A greedy smile flashed across Windroth's face as he opened his mouth and hissed like a snake. His fangs were white enough to be in a toothpaste commercial, though I thought I saw a drop of red blood drip from one. But I was already moving forward, and my silver dagger found his arm before he could plunge his fangs into Tabitha's neck. The vampire hissed again, though this time it sounded more pained. The vampire tried to jerk his arm away, and the movement gave Tabitha the opening she needed to squirm free. Maybe I'll turn you into a vampire after I kill this pup, Windroth hissed at Tabitha as she scooted across the floor. I reached for the vampire's neck, but the bastard was fast. He ducked beneath my grasp, and then the next thing I knew, the creepy bastard was trying to climb his way up my armor. I tried to shake him off like he was an insect, but the vampire's nails gave him enough grip to hang onto the armor. He gave me a smug smile as he climbed higher, and soon I could smell his fetid breath. I realized he was heading for the exposed skin between my chest plate and the helmet, and I wondered if that was how the other knights had been killed. Well, today was not Windroth's lucky day. I grabbed him with my left hand and yanked on him until he finally lost his grip on the armor. As he tried to find something else to hold on to, I flung him like a shot put into the wall of the temple. There was a loud crack as he crashed into the obsidian, and a puff of black sediment flew out of the wall as he fell to the floor. Now was my chance to kill the vampire, but I saw Sybil leaning over Tabitha, who still seemed to be having trouble getting to her feet. Here! I shouted as I pulled the healing amulet from my neck and tossed it toward the witch. The witch snagged the amulet, but then her eyes went wide and she started to say something. I spun around and, no surprise, the vampire was back on his feet. He plowed into me, and though I stumbled back a step, I managed to keep my balance. He started to hit me in the legs and to grab onto the armor in an attempt to knock me down, but I started to punch him in the head. He hissed with each blow, but he was still fast enough to avoid more than a scratch from the dagger. Give up, puppy, or you'll have to watch me kill your women, the vampire panted. In a flash, he was out of my grasp and nearly on top of the women. I was right behind him, but he still managed to grab Sybil's arm, and the witch yelped as the vampire's claws sank into her skin. No fucking way! I shouted as I grabbed the vampire's shirt. I jerked so hard that both Wenderoth and I went sailing backwards. We clattered to the floor, and I felt the full weight of my armor as I tried to get up. The vampire was sure he had the advantage then, and I saw the evil grin on his face as he clambered on top of me. His fangs glinted as he opened his mouth, but he'd forgotten about the silver dagger that I still clutched in my hand. I waited until I was sure he couldn't wriggle away, and then I plunged the blade into his back. "You stupid mongrel," the vampire cursed as he tried to crawl away. "You are the idiot who forgot I held the dagger." I yanked the blade from his back and then drove it in again. There was another hissing sound and he finally stopped crawling. "Look, dog boy," he coughed. "At least look at me when you kill me. Don't be a coward who stabs someone in the back." Well, I'd already done that, but I pulled my dagger out of his back again and flipped him over. "I'm no coward," I growled. "You Lupercalians have no idea." He laughed wildly as the red glow of his eyes began to flicker. "You have no idea what is in store for you all. This is only the beginning." "The beginning of what?" I asked. "Oh, you'll find out, puppy," he said and coughed. "And you won't like it one bit." I wanted to know more, but the vampire used the last of his immense strength to lunge toward me again. I did the only thing I could and drove the dagger straight into his skull. The red light disappeared, and his jaw flopped open. "One last time. Are you both okay?" I asked as I looked at the women. "Yes," Sybil said, but Tabitha could only nod. "Well," I said, "that was Wenderoth. But what do you think he meant about the beginning?" I felt something pawing at my foot and looked down. From my 9-foot height, Casanova looked even smaller. "Hey, little guy," I laughed. I bent down and scooped him up with my right hand. With my left I pulled off my helmet and let it fall on the ground. It felt good to get some air on my face, even if this place did smell like rot and decay. Casanova licked my cheeks and my nose while he wagged his little tail. When I placed him on my shoulder, he nestled comfortably between my neck and my shoulder armor. "Hank," Sybil said, "that was incredible. If you pounced a second later, I would have been a snack." Tabitha croaked as she tried to sit up. "What happened?" I asked as I walked over to them. "My knee," Tabitha replied with a grimace. "But the amulet helped. I can actually feel it healing." "It wasn't broken," Sybil added, "but it was definitely tweaked. I can give you some salve to help speed up the healing process." "Okay," I said and looked around. "I don't think there's anyone else in here. Are you two okay if I look around?" "We're fine," Sybil replied as she pulled a small jar from her basket. I watched the pair for another moment, then stood up and moved toward the spot where Wenderoth had appeared. Whatever treasure he might have had was probably downstairs, since that seemed to be his lair. "I'll be right downstairs," I said. "We'll be right here," Sybil replied as she sniffed one of her jars. "Yes, this will do. Ginger, rosemary, and pepper. Tabitha, I'm going to take off your boot and roll up your pants." Tabitha groaned, and that seemed like a signal to leave the two women alone. As I passed Wenderoth's body, I knelt down and pulled the dagger from his head and the chain from around his neck. I knew that he was a vampire, but I was still shocked to see that no blood came from the wound at all. It almost made the whole ordeal seem less real. With the dagger recovered, I made my way to the stairs. Close I saw that they were made of gray stone instead of obsidian, which made me think that maybe they weren't a part of the original plan. I put my foot down on one of the steps, which crumbled slightly as I shifted my weight onto it. Wenderoth had been significantly smaller than my hybrid form, and the steps clearly weren't designed to handle a full werewolf. It looked like I was going to have to complete this mission in human form. "Go back to Sybil, little buddy," I said as I put the puppy on the ground. "Keep them safe while I'm downstairs." He barked and then obediently scampered over to the girls. I shook my head back and forth and imagined myself in my human form. When I opened my eyes, I was a human again, and the journey into the dark space seemed more manageable. I clutched my sack and headed down into the basement. There were only about 5 steps, and a grate over my head let in some of the light from the temple. I'd expected the place to smell like death and decay as well, but all I could detect with my human nose was damp and spices. The room at the end of the steps was small, and it reminded me of the room where the choir robes had been stored in my boyhood church. There wasn't much to see beyond a desk with a flickering candle and another cigar box. Clearly, The vampires in Lupercalia were big smokers, but then again they didn't have to worry about cancer, so why not? When I flipped open the cover of the box, I was surprised to find that it was actually full of herbs. I removed the dried leaves from the box, but instead of finding anything good hiding underneath, there was only a small leather-bound manuscript. At any other time, I probably wouldn't have opened the volume because I didn't want to be the kind of guy who read someone else's diary. But since this was the only clue I had to the location of the vampire's loot, I picked it up and flipped to the first page. There were pages and pages of tiny writing, and even with my wolf-enhanced sight, I had to squint just to make out a few of the letters. I sighed and decided I would need a magnifying glass if I was going to decipher any of the tight cursive writing in that journal, but further in I found some illustrations. The first sketch was of what looked like some sort of gemstone with an arrow pointed to it. Makes poisonous were the only words I could make out, though I wasn't sure if the gems could be used to poison something or if the gems could be made poisonous. This could definitely be useful, I muttered as I turned a few more pages. The next illustrations were maps of what I assumed to be different parts of Lupercalia because they were of natural landscapes. Winderoth had drawn large circles over certain parts, which he'd covered with gold leaf. They were clearly important to the vampire for some reason, though I had no way of knowing if one of the spots held his loot or just another nest of vampires. The most interesting sketch was on the last page of the book, though. Showed what looked like two Earths side by side. A large black dot was drawn next to each planet, though the position of the dot was different. Every sci-fi show that featured people traveling through a wormhole flashed through my mind, and I wondered if the ring I wore was somehow tied to these two black dots. Was it possible that the vampires knew about my home planet, and even worse, that they could somehow get there? That was a scary thought, and I definitely needed to take a closer look at Winderoth's journal. I shoved it into my sack and then took another look around the room. I found it hard to believe that the vampire hadn't kept some of his moonsilver nearby, but then again Winderoth was clearly smarter than the average vampire. "Hank!" Sybil shouted, though she didn't sound panicked or worried. "Yeah," I called out as I moved toward the stairs. "Hank Casanova's found something," Sybil replied. Back in the temple proper, I spotted Casanova scratching at a spot on the floor. The pup looked like he was determined to dig through the hard rock, and he even growled in frustration when he couldn't reach whatever was on the other side. "What is it, little guy?" I asked as I made my way over. I looked at where he was pawing on the floor and saw that there was a large crack. When I knelt down for a closer look, I saw that the crack was really more of a seam between stones, and the lack of dust suggested that someone had moved one of the stones recently. I traced the seam with my fingers until I found a spot in the top right corner where a dagger could just slide in. My own dagger fit into the narrow slit easily, and even in my human form I was surprised at how smoothly the tile lifted from its spot. I grabbed it with my other hand and then pushed it out of the way so I could see what had been hidden beneath the floor. "Guys," I smiled. "I think we've hit the jack." Chapter 22. The treasure in front of me glittered as the light hit it, and I felt myself grinning as I took in the treasure. There were bars of moonsilver and 2 silver necklaces, but the thing that caught my eye was the large dagger with opals in the hilt. It took me a moment to realize that the opals looked exactly like the ones in Winderoth's book. So, did that mean that the dagger had poisonous qualities? Now, that could be handy, though I'd have to find a way to test my theory. There were several other opals lying loose in the pile, and I thought they'd make a nice addition to the sword I was planning to create. Between the moon silver and the potentially poisonous opals, I'd have one hell of a weapon. And there was enough moonsilver in the hole to get me started. Just a little more, and I'd be ready to think about forging my own sword. I could already picture it in my head, though I was still undecided what type of design I wanted on the hilt. But I had time to figure it out. "Casanova," I smiled at the puppy, who sat proudly by the hole full of treasure. "You really are a prize direwolf." He scampered over to me and pawed at my leg. This really was the beginning of a great team. "Hank," Sybil said as she leaned over the hole, "I've never seen so much treasure in one place. You're making me jealous." Tabitha called over. "Oh, don't complain," Sybil laughed. "You grew up in a palace. I'm sure you saw knights returning with much larger hoards than this." "Fine," Tabitha drawled. "Just leave me here to rot like all these other poor souls." Here lies Tabitha Blueclaw, left behind for a few baubles. I was feeling so giddy that I actually giggled and then burst out laughing. It was still hard to believe that these last few days had actually happened to me, and as I stared at the loot, all I could think was that this had been the most successful week of my life. Are you okay, Hank? Sybil giggled. I've never seen you so excited. Ah, Sybil, I chuckled. Things are too good to be true. There's so much to be grateful for. The witch smiled back at me and then looked into the hole full of treasure. Except for the smell, Tabitha called over. I reached in and started to scoop all of the bars, jewelry, and opals into my bag. I would have been happy to defend Lupercalia even if there wasn't any loot, but these kinds of rewards made everything way better. Here, Sybil said. I'll help. My sack was soon full, even though there were still bars of moon silver and a few opals in the hole. I tried stuffing a few more opals in my sack, but there was no room left. I could try putting some in my basket, Sybil said, but I don't think it'll hold all of this. I heard a shuffling behind me and saw Tabitha hobbling over with her sack. This should help, Tabitha said and tossed the sack toward me. When it hit the ground, a cloud of black dust formed around it. Tabitha, Sybil scolded. You shouldn't be up so quickly. Oh, it's no bother, Tabitha insisted. That salve you put on me worked wonders. You're the most absurdly talented healer I've ever met in my life. Hope you know that. Thanks, Sybil replied as her cheeks turned a dark crimson color. I'm sure that the amulet helped as well. Yes, I'm sure, Tabitha said. But I won't hear of you selling yourself short. You should be employed by the palace as an expert or something. Sybil quickly looked away, but I could see that the witch was smiling. The dark-haired woman snatched up the canvas sack and started to scoop the rest of our loot into the bag before I could even comment on Tabitha's suggestion. There, Sybil declared as she sat back. That's the last of it. Then let's get out of here, I replied. That lavender isn't working so well anymore. I can't wait to tell the king that we've cleared the obsidian temple, Tabitha replied. I'm sure there will be a party to celebrate. The palace always seems to find a reason to celebrate, Sybil teased. But I do think that reclaiming the obsidian temple is a good reason for a party. I smiled, but then I thought back to the leather-bound book in my bag. Didn't want to spoil the mood, but I had to tell the king about what Wenderoth had claimed. It seemed like things were far from over, and I wondered if anyone could decipher his cryptic notes. But first we had to return to the palace. I slung my sack across my back and, in my human form, it felt very heavy. I tried not to wince under the weight as I stared at the other sack. Here, Casanova, Sybil cooed as she plopped the puppy into her basket. The witch kissed the pup on top of his head and then picked up the second sack as easily as if she were lifting a feather pillow. Are you okay with that? I asked in surprise. Do you have any idea how much hay I've hauled in my life? She laughed. I'll be fine. Let's just get out of here. Yes, please, Tabitha said as she started to hobble toward the door. Well, I can still help Tabitha, I said with a smirk. I scooped the noblewoman into my arms, who felt nearly weightless despite the armor she wore. She started to protest, but gave in as I picked my way through the piles of bones and other hazards that could have easily tripped her up. When we stepped outside, we were met by a cool evening breeze that carried the scent of wildflowers and moss. It smelled so alive and so green that I took a deep breath and held it for a few seconds just so I could savor how wonderful it was. I had never smelled that much death and rot in one place, and I knew I never wanted to again. I could drink in this air forever, Tabitha sighed. It's tempting, I said, but I think we need to get back to the palace as quickly as possible. Are you okay with riding through the night? Aren't you determined to party? Tabitha laughed. That's me, I replied, though something in my tone must have given me away. Both women studied me for a moment, and then Sybil finally nodded. Tabitha had suddenly become more solemn as well, and she slid from my arms without further comment. I transformed so quickly that I barely had time to picture my wolf shape. Once the girls were settled and the loot that wouldn't transform with me was safely strapped to my back, I started to gallop back through the ghost town. I barely registered the buildings we passed or the small creatures that were starting to emerge for the night. All I could think about was getting back to the palace. At this pace we'll be at the palace within hours, Tabitha shouted into my ear as the wind whipped past. Perfect, I thought. The moon had risen as we ran past the inn, and owls called to each other as I flew beneath the trees. I was moving faster than I had ever done in my life. Yet my wolf instincts helped me avoid anything that might slow me down. It was an amazing feeling, yet I couldn't shake the notion that I needed to run even faster. The soft, mossy ground gave way to packed earth, and I knew we were nearing the edge of the forest. The fields near the palace spread out ahead of us, bathed in moonlight. Since there was no need to stick to the path with my night vision, I sprinted over the grass and through a wheat field to save some time. "We're home!" Tabitha cried out triumphantly as the drawbridge came into view. I didn't slow down until we were about 10 yards from the drawbridge. I could see that the flags were still up, and a soft breeze sent them rippling against the midnight sky. A fog had rolled in, but it wasn't the thick clouds that had greeted us near the temple. This was more like wisps of magic that floated across the ground to give everything a gentle glow. Even though I'd only been in Lupercalia a week, this place already felt like home, and that the moon goddess was shining over us. It felt like she had willed our success, and this beautiful night was her reward. I slowed down to a walk and felt the dewy grass underneath my paws. Couldn't believe that the quest was already over. We had defeated Windroth, and I had run faster than I could possibly imagine back to show the king everything we'd achieved. The hybrid knights on duty didn't even look at us as we approached the bridge. No doubt they were used to knights returning at all hours from their quests, but I had to admit, part of me would have liked to have at least received a nod like Charles. "I can't believe we're already back," Sybil mumbled, and I thought I heard her yawn. I sat down on the soft, dewy ground at the edge of the moat and waited for the girls to dismount. Sybil slid off first, followed by Tabitha. The noblewoman gave me an affectionate pat on the head before I stood up again. "Just so you know," she said, "I've never even seen a horse run that fast. You ever lose steam as a knight, you could have a racing career ahead of you." If wolves could roll their eyes, I would have. Instead, I made a snorting sound and shook my head. I spotted Casanova peering over the edge of the basket then, and I could see the excitement in his face. The pup whined softly at me, and I got the sense that he was saying, "I'm excited but tired." "Don't worry, little one," I growled back. "We're back home now." That seemed to work, because he brushed his face with his front paws and curled up in the basket again. It had certainly been a long day for the little puppy, and as I watched him snuggle down among the herbs, I realized that the fight and the long run back to the castle had taken it out of me as well. But there was still some business I needed to tend to before I could head for my own bed. I stood on my hind legs and imagined myself back in my hybrid form, and when I opened my eyes, I was a 9-foot-tall, armored wolfman just like the guards guarding the castle. "I'm not sure which form is the most impressive," Tabitha said, "but I like them all." "They're all handsome," Sybil replied with a grin. "And strong," Tabitha added. I was grinning as I started across the drawbridge, and maybe I was walking just a little taller as I neared the guards. I nodded to the knights, and then caught a whiff of something that reminded me of stuffing on Thanksgiving. Realized that the smell was sage, so the king's witches must have found the lamb's ear sage that was needed to make the poison for the moat. We walked across the drawbridge without speaking, though Tabitha's boots and armor, as well as mine, clanked loudly against the wooden bridge, while Sybil seemed to glide effortlessly as if she had no weight at all. "How's your knee doing?" I asked when we reached the other side. "Oh, it's nothing," Tabitha waved her hand. "Come on," I said. "Don't be a stoic. I don't want you to push yourself if you're hurting. You're no good to me as a squire if you're injured." "Really?" she insisted. Whatever Sybil put on my knee made my leg feel brand new. I'm not lying when I say that salve was genius. "Oh, stop," Sybil giggled and blushed. "There's one other thing, though," Tabitha said as we stopped for a moment to gaze up at the walls of the palace. "You know that a knight needs an estate, don't you? You can't be a true knight without your own lands." I furrowed my brow in confusion. Neither Charles nor any of the other knights had told me about this, and even the king himself had failed to mention that these knights had estates. "Wait," I replied. "An estate like a place of my own?" "Well, of course," she laughed. "Thank goodness you have me here to tell you how things work in Lupercalia." All right, I shrugged. "But what do you mean by an estate? Your dad is a knight, and you grew up in the palace, right? So do I just need an acre of land somewhere, or am I supposed to have an actual castle and stuff?" All young nobles are raised in the castle, she explained. It's to ensure that we all learn the proper rules of being a noble person, and though no one will admit this, to make it easier to find a spouse. But all the knights are landowners and have homes of their own. Some prefer to remain on their own estates, while others, like my father, prefer to remain close to the king. It's really up to the knight, though obviously you're expected to come to court on certain important days or if summoned. Tabitha's instruction was cut off with a yawn. She put her hands on her breastplate, leaned back, and let out the most confidently loud yawn I'd heard in my life. Don't be shy, Sybil laughed. I'm not, Tabitha continued, and shot a smile at Sybil. Anyway, knights need an estate not only to support themselves financially, but also as a sign of rank. Although knights are put in a position to win a lot of silver and silver through things like quests and jousting, it is usually advisable that a knight makes money from his land ownership as well. It's more sustainable. And furthermore, it can be passed to his descendants and provide an income for them as well. Ah, Sybil quipped playfully. So that's how you guys stay so rich? Sybil was obviously joking, which I could tell from the light tone of her voice, but Tabitha turned bright pink and looked at the cobblestones with a sense of shame. I suppose it's just how these things work, she said. I tried to imagine having an estate of my own. No longer would I just be some guy who lived in a normal one-story house in small-town Jersey. I was going to be a werewolf knight with my own estate. That meant my own house on my own land, and I could fill it with my own puppy and the women who helped me on this quest. And I was determined not to be one of those landowners who charge people some outrageous price to live on my property. There was no way that this entirely transformative experience would end with me just being some shitty landlord who couldn't even be bothered to install fire alarms. No, I was going to be a farmer. A coffee bean farmer. Tabitha, I prompted my young, attractive squire. Yes, she responded politely. How common is it to have your estate be a farm? I asked. She crinkled her nose and brought her hand to her chin to think. I don't think it's that uncommon, depending on what type of farm it is, she replied a moment later. Most nobles lease the land to tenant farmers. The farmers then pay for their lease with a portion of what they grow. My father has a few tenant farmers who grow wheat and several vegetables, as well as raising chickens and pigs. Whatever they don't turn over to my father, they can keep for themselves or sell for a profit. I know there are knights that have silver mines on their property, and those are very profitable. Though there's always the danger that the silver will run out. And there's that knight from the south who sells dirt from his lands. A dirt farm? I chuckled. He's one of the wealthiest knights in the kingdom, Tabitha said with a shrug. Oh, Sybil cooed dreamily. We can have a flower farm, and we can grow spices and herbs and vegetables ourselves to make all kinds of brews and tinctures. And a pig or two, of course. Well, of course we can have some herbs and flowers, I agreed. But that's not what I had in mind as the primary crop for my estate. Then what are you planning? Tabitha asked as she folded her arms across her chest. I glanced back at the two knights, and while the one on the left was still ignoring me, the one on the right gave me a slight nod. I nodded back quickly, before the girls had even noticed, but that was okay. It was enough to know that I was finally winning over some of the other knights after all. Come here, I said, and led the way to the olive tree. I'd rather tell you, away from prying ears. Oh, Tabitha cooed. Now I'm really intrigued. The girls sat down on the low wall that surrounded the tree, and I could tell that both of them were trying not to yawn. I glanced around again, but the courtyard was still empty. Nonetheless, I leaned in closer. All right, I said. Remember how I gave all those moonbeans to Ava to sell? Moonbean brew in New Jersey. Of course, Tabitha drawled. I couldn't believe how you two were raving about a simple peasant's drink. It was very odd, Sybil agreed, but it sounded like everyone else who tried it really enjoyed it as well. I want to start a moonbean farm, I said. Basically, we're going to grow as many moonbeans here as possible, in their natural habitat. Then I'm going to ship them to New Jersey with my magic ring, and sell them for as much as we can. In the shop, we're going to make a killing. People will pay big bucks for this stuff, and we'll be living like kings and queens everywhere we go in my land. Sound good? The two women were looking at me, though I wasn't quite sure what to make of their expressions. There was definitely surprise and confusion there, but they also didn't look completely opposed to my idea. The witch and the noblewoman then turned to look at each other, and I once again had the feeling that they were having some sort of private conversation. I know kings, Tabitha finally said, and it sounds like we'll be living even better than that. I could live like that, Sybil laughed. That's what I like to hear, I replied with a grin. Tabitha mused. This would be a good time to request land now that you've slain Wenderoth. The king really can't deny anything you request. You could ask him for a moonbeam farm. That will probably set the rumor mill in motion, Sybil said. The rest of the nobles will wonder what you plan to do with all those moonbeams. It's not like it's a cash crop. And I'm sure Hector will have something to say about it, Tabitha added. Let them gossip, I said, and waved away their concerns. We have a monopoly on moonbeam sales in New Jersey, and will soon be the richest people in the kingdom. I like the sound of that, Tabitha laughed. Come on, I said as I stood up. Let's go get our estate. I led the way through the archway and opened the door into the servants' corridor. Tabitha shot me a look but ducked inside without saying anything. Sybil, however, looked surprised when she stepped into the decidedly less glamorous hallway, and she looked at me suspiciously as the door slammed shut behind us. I'm thinking this isn't the passage the king uses, Sybil noted. It's for the servants, Tabitha explained. I want to surprise everyone, I said as I bounded toward the stairs. More stairs, Sybil sighed. I managed to restrain myself on the staircase, but by the time we reached the rosette window I was having a hard time not running straight to the door. Could hear the sounds of late-night revelry in the banquet hall, and I wondered if anybody ever went to bed in this place. Well, at least I'd have an audience for my presentation to the king. Here goes, I said as I knocked on the door. There was a scuffling sound from the other side of the door, and a moment later, the door swung open to reveal Sebastian, who was wearing an emerald green velvet tunic with his usual leggings and a hat with a bright yellow feather on top. He was carrying his long trumpet in his right hand and had a chicken drumstick in his left. He jumped back when he saw all of us, and pressed his long trumpet to the floor. He swallowed the chicken he was chewing on and straightened his back, which increased his height by maybe 1/10 of an inch. Why, Henry of New Jersey, he choked. And company, of course. He made a small perfunctory bow at the ladies, and Sybil replied with a curtsy, but Tabitha only bowed her head a mere inch. Yep, I smiled. We're back. How's it going? Well, it's been barely any time at all since I last saw you, he laughed. So, I'd say same as it ever was. He stepped back and ushered us into the dining hall, which smelled like thyme, butter and grilled meat. My mouth started to water, and I glanced at the tables to see what the night's offering was. There were platters of roast chicken, large sides of beef, stewed broad beans, and baked potatoes slathered in butter. Still steaming rolls sat in large baskets on the tables, and bowls of grapes and strawberries added a sweet contrast. One of the servants went by with a large jug filled with hot spiced wine, and I could almost taste the apples, oranges, and cinnamon. Seems a bit warm outside for spiced wine, I remarked. Today is Greyback's birthday, Sebastian explained, and by Lupercalian tradition, the court celebrates the birthdays of every knight of the realm by eating their favorite foods. He wants mulled wine in this weather? Tabitha whined. That's madness, true. Madness. Tabitha, Sebastian chided. How many times has the court had to eat creamed corn for your father's birthday? It haunts me to this day. I won't hear any complaints about mulled wine in the middle of summer. Tabitha rolled her eyes at the tiny squire, but then she looked at me and winked. I've come to tell the king about Wenderoth, I said as I looked toward the dais with the lute from the vampire in hand. The king was there, but he wasn't seated on the throne. Instead, he sat at a small round table with Greyback. The two men were sharing a generous portion of roast chicken and buttery potatoes, and aside from the clothing, they looked like two middle-aged friends enjoying a meal together. I could almost regret interrupting their meal. But Sebastian brought his trumpet to his lips and blew out a short, perfunctory trill. The banquet hall slowly fell quiet, and I could see people looking around to see who had arrived. Eventually, everyone turned toward the servants' entrance, and the whisper started up before Sebastian could even formally announce my return. To His Majesty, the King of Lupercalia, Sebastian shouted with all of his might. I wish to present to you Henry the Baker of New Jersey, who has returned from his quest to the Obsidian Temple. The king, who stood up and squinted at me, and it felt like everyone in the room was holding their breath. Eyes darted between the king and I, and for a moment I was actually worried that the king was going to toss me out of the court. Come here, boy, the king laughed, and prove to us that you have indeed defeated the vampire Wenderoth. I nodded and started to walk slowly along the aisle formed by the long tables. I could hear Sybil and Tabitha walking behind me, as well as the whispers that followed us all the way to the dais, but I kept my eyes straight ahead and all I could see was the king, who waited patiently, and Greyback, who remained in his chair with a leg of chicken in one hand. Well then, Henry the Baker, the king said when I stopped in front of him. You have proof of Wenderoth's death? I held my bag of loot, as did Tabitha. I then set mine in front of the king and opened the top so the man could look inside. The king ran his hand through the silver, held up a couple of the larger opals for everyone to see, and then nodded to me. Well done, Henry, the king declared. That's my girl. I heard a voice to the right yell, and when I looked over, Blueclaw was being hushed by the other knights of the realm. However, he waved his fist in the air at Tabitha and gave her a knowing wink. Tabitha snickered and blew a small kiss to her father, but then immediately looked back and tried to keep a straight face for the king as she placed her own sack in front of the king. Such riches, the king mused as she stared at the second bag. But this is nothing when compared to the knowledge that the Obsidian Temple has been cleansed. Lupercalia owes you a great debt, Henry the Baker of New Jersey. To Hank, Charles shouted from one of the nearby tables. I looked over my shoulder and spotted the knight. He was sitting with a pretty woman with ginger hair who gave me a genuinely kind smile and a nod. Across from the pair were two adorable little kids, a boy and a girl. The knight had never said anything to me about having a family before, but it made complete sense to me, given what Tabitha had told me. Henry, come up here, the king called. And your ladies as well. Oh my, Sybil murmured as we stepped onto the dais. Henry, the king welcomed me with outstretched arms. How does it feel to be an eternal